afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. This is the first fresh webinar of 2017. My name is Mohini Venkatesh. I hope you can hear me clearly. And I'm here to introduce the speakers and the presentation for today's webinar. Today we will be talking about school-related gender-based violence. We'll be hearing from three of our esteemed speakers. First from Jenelle Babb from UNESCO Paris. Jenelle will be introducing us to the newly developed global guidance on addressing school-related gender-based violence. Jenelle has been working in the area of HIV prevention education and sexuality education for over 10 years with experience in the Caribbean, and now as part of her global portfolio, she's based out of Paris. We'll then be hearing from Julie Swanson from USAID. Julie is the Acting Education Chief in the Africa Bureau, and she's served over 8 years in the Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID, and this builds on over 30 years of her previous experience on a range of different issues from formal and non-formal education, adolescent reproductive health, and gender. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Hassan Muluusi from Raising Voices, Uganda. Hassan will be telling us about the Good School approach in Uganda and how it has been successful in reducing gender-based violence in schools. Hassan is a professional teacher, and he currently works as a program officer on violence against children. So with that, I pass it over to our first speaker, Jenelle.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you might be. Thank you, Mohini, for the introduction and getting us started. I'm just going to encourage all of us if we could just mute our mics so the listening experience is equally good for everyone. I am delighted to be able to present to you today our recently released global guidance on school-related gender-based violence, or SRGB, as I'll refer to it. This guidance is intended as a comprehensive resource that brings together tools and examples based on the evidence to support effective, holistic responses to SRGB. Our major audiences are the education sector, teachers' unions, as well as partners from among civil society, funding agencies, and of course in other sectors. So today, I'll explain why this guidance has been developed, what's inside the document, and how it might be used to advance policy and programming in this area. I know that the online link to the guidance was sent out with this webinar invitation, so I won't go into too much detail right now, but I do encourage you to dive into the document right away, either during my presentation or following it. First slide, Mohini. So there are probably many of us who are already familiar with the concept of school-related gender-based violence, which can be defined as acts or threats of sexual, physical, or psychological violence occurring in and around schools, perpetrated as a result of gender norms and stereotypes and enforced by unequal power dynamics. I'm just checking in that the slides that is advancing so that you can all see. Mohini, are you?
I'm on slide 3 of 42.
Okay, I'm sorry, because I'm not actually seeing the advance. That's fine. So we're actually, yes, on slide 3. Young people have a different experience of SRGBV depending on their gender identity, their country, and context. But we know that gender-based violence in or around schools can affect both boys and girls, that learners can be the victims or the perpetrators, and that school staff can also be either perpetrators or victims. The research data tells us that girls are more likely to experience psychological bullying, cyberbullying, sexual violence, and harassment. Boys, on the other hand, often face higher rates of corporal punishment than girls. There's also a growing body of evidence that indicates that most LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender, and to a lesser extent intersex students, report having experienced bullying or violence on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. SRGBV is a global phenomenon that affects millions of children, their families, and communities, and it's been documented in every country of the world. Next slide. So why does it matter? Well, as education personnel and as people working to eliminate gender-based violence, we should be shocked to know that almost 250 million children experience SRGBV every year. In fact, this figure relates largely to bullying and as such may be a gross underestimate of the number of children also experiencing physical or sexual violence. Beyond these numbers, however, SRGBV violates children's fundamental human rights and is a form of gender discrimination. Children have the right to be protected from all forms of violence, including in their school lives. Experiencing SRGBV can compromise children's well-being, their physical and emotional health, as well as harming their cognitive and emotional development. SRGBV interferes with the education of many young people and is correlated with lower academic achievement. This may be as a result of the psychological consequences, which leads to low self-esteem and poor concentration, or it may be because children will miss school or drop out if they are victims of violence. It's also a major barrier to the realization of global education goals and targets, as well as specific Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to end violence against children in all settings, Target 16.2, to provide safe and supportive learning environments, Goal 4, achieve gender equality, as well as eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, Goal 5. Recent research from USAID demonstrates that SRGBV can be associated with the loss of one primary grade of schooling, which translates to a yearly cost of $17 billion to low and middle-income countries. In a multi-sectoral response to gender-based violence, we cannot ignore the important role that education and schools play. Not only is school increasingly being recognized as a place where gender-based violence occurs, we also see schools and education more broadly as an important socializing mechanism, which is critical for the social, emotional, and psychological development of young people. As such, education is a vehicle for transforming individual behaviors and broader social norms around violence, gender equality, and discrimination. Next. Slide 5. In 2014, UNESCO and UNGAI conducted a rapid scan of programs, policies, and commitments related to SRGBV. What we found was an increasing global recognition of the issue and some studies into the prevalence of gender-based violence in schools, which were leading to more numerous programmatic responses by a range of different actors. However, limited resources and gaps in political leadership meant that these responses were largely fragmented, small-scale, or time-bound. The working group identified a series of priority actions that would help to shift the local, national, and global response to SRGBV. Evidence on the effectiveness of different approaches and lessons learned are increasingly being documented, and the mechanisms for sharing knowledge and resources are improving. We felt that the quality and scale of responses to SRGBV globally could be greatly enhanced by the availability of clear, operational, and knowledge-based guidance for the education sector and other actors working to eliminate gender-based violence in and around school settings. We also knew that we needed to draw together good practice and lessons learned and bring this knowledge together into one combined guidance document that can also be used as a tool for opening up conversations about SRGBV and helping ministries or other stakeholders to appreciate the urgency of the problem and see practical ways of responding. Next slide, slide 6. We recognize that SRGBV is not a standalone issue, but one that crosses the boundaries and responsibilities of a number of sectors. Within the Agenda 2030 framework, we therefore see opportunities for action under a number of SDGs, particularly on education and gender equality, but also the SDGs on health and well-being, on just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, and of course, the SDG on partnerships. Next slide. Slide 7. Partnerships. The guidance builds on the individual mandates of the two co-publishing organizations, UNESCO and UN Women, and it brings together the benefit of our individual expertise to this joint effort. The development of the guidance has only been possible because of the active engagement of numerous partners, sharing evidence, good practice and case studies, reviewing the text, and ensuring that it reflects the latest knowledge from the fields of child protection, education, and gender-based violence. It's published jointly by UNESCO and UN Women and was researched and written by Social Development Direct Consultancy Group. We're immensely grateful to our civil society partners, Educational International, Plan International, ActionAid, Concern Worldwide, to the governments of Norway, Sweden, USA, and Germany who supported the work both technically and financially, to representatives of ministries in Ghana and Nigeria who gave important input during field testing, and to our UN partners, UNGAI, UNFPA, UNICEF, WHO, and the IATT on education. So, what is in the global guidance? Slide 8. Section 1, Understanding SRGBV. Slide 9. First of all, the guidance helps establish the rationale for addressing SRGBV. It presents, in particular, the formative role of education in society and its critical role within the 2030 Development Agenda. Education is essential in empowering children to become active participants in the transformation of their societies, and that learning should include a focus on values, attitudes, and behaviors that will enable individuals to live together in a world that is diverse and plural. The guidance also highlights that violence against women and girls remains not only a barrier to gender equality, girls' empowerment, and overall sustainable development, but it is also an impediment to the achievement of other SDGs. The what and the why that I presented earlier in this presentation are covered in this part of the guidance, along with the scale of the problem, the health and social consequences, as well as new data on the cost of inaction, which is high. The costs of not addressing SRGBV go beyond the education sector and are also borne by social services as well as law enforcement. But we must also recognize that, despite the amazing transformative powers of education, there are significant constraints in addressing SRGBV. The complex nature of SRGBV, the lack of understanding that surrounds the concept, and the sensitive nature of the issues are some of the challenges facing the education sector in particular. In addition, schools must face strong socio-cultural norms about violence, as well as about gender equality or inequality. Education systems in many countries are already enormously overstretched, not least as a result of successes in increasing the numbers of children, including girls, who attend school. The gaps in data and in monitoring are also an impediment to putting programs in place and monitoring their effectiveness. Next slide, slide 10. Here are some key programming principles to be adhered to when developing or implementing SRGBV interventions. The primary principle is to take a holistic whole school approach, which takes into account all elements of the planning, delivery, and monitoring of education for a child. Beyond this, a child-centered approach is crucial, and the concept of do no harm. Reporting mechanisms, as an example, must be developed in such a way that no child is exposed or made more vulnerable. Finally, it's also important to highlight that the environment of the school. Beyond school-based interventions, addressing violence requires concerted action at national, community, and individual levels, and the mobilization of all actors: government, civil society, the UN system, businesses, schools, men, women, boys, and girls. Next, slide 11. This section, section 2, is the heart of the guidance, where we can find the case studies, practical actions, and recommendations for effective interventions. For the first time, this publication demonstrates, from the UN perspective, a shared understanding of what an effective response should include. On the basis of a thorough review of all available evidence conducted in 2015 and a review of program documentation from all around the world, we have developed a programming framework that outlines what a holistic response to SRGBV should look like. This is the part of the guidance that contains the case studies, checklists, and practical actions that can serve as guiding examples for program or policy developers. Our role was to bring together this wealth of experience and highlight the abundance of program expertise available to a wider audience within a structured framework. Next slide, slide 12. These then are the 6 areas that we recommend. which, when delivered together, will form a comprehensive program of action that is more likely to lead to improvements in gender equality, reductions in gender-based violence, and support for those experiencing violence in or around school. First of all is leadership at national or government level. This leadership is the starting point for any wide-scale action and can be framed within education sector reform and existing policies. Next is a focus on the school environment to ensure that all schools are safe and supportive. This includes recommendations on infrastructure, such as well-lit classrooms and safe toilets, as well as the leadership required from the school management and governing bodies to state clearly that gender-based violence is neither acceptable nor tolerated. Here too, we recommend a holistic approach, which means in addition to safe environments, codes of conduct for all school staff and also learners must be put in place and enforced. Preventing gender-based violence through curricular and non-curricular approaches is the focus of Component 3. This is the most well-documented approach, and there are numerous examples of programs to address violence and or gender inequality. Within this component, we make recommendations about support for teachers to develop effective, learner-centered pedagogical approaches and the tools to recognize and address SRGBV when it happens. Component 4 looks at responses to violence in and around schools, primarily the confidential reporting mechanisms required at school level and the provision of counseling and support. As we know, these objectives can't be achieved without working in partnership. And on SRGBV, this means working with teachers and their unions, with families and the community. Finally, given the paucity of reliable evidence on the scale of SRGBV, the final component in our matrix concerns monitoring and evaluation, providing some possible indicator sets which have been tested in schools and recommendations on safe and effective approaches to research on SRGBV. Now, taken all together, it perhaps seems a bit idealistic, but we do recognize that each country or state will take steps towards that goal, and that each piece of the puzzle will advance at different speeds. It's important to acknowledge this strength-based approach while seeing all of the pieces, and therefore, with this holistic view, better be able to see what's missing. For example, in many countries, there are extracurricular programs on gender or violence, but in-curricular content is not strong enough, which is the only way to be sure all learners are benefiting. In other settings, the lack of a legal or policy framework makes it hard to put in place actions at school level. Ideally, all components will be developed and delivered in harmony across different sectors and by different actors, and we hope that the guidance will be a step in that direction. Next slide, slide 13. So now you know what the guidance is for, what it's about, and how can you access it. Well, the guidance is available online, and the link was previously sent with the webinar invitation, but actually through various websites listed here. It's also accessible in a more user-friendly online version, particularly for those places with slower internet connections, at UN Women's online virtual knowledge center, www.endviolenceagainstwomennow.org. Next slide, 14. Now that the guidance has been published, we can think about the actions that all of us can take to use this document. Firstly, recognize SRGBV as a critical issue within your stakeholder group. This may be a government ministry, a local education group, a civil society organization, or maybe a donor or UN setting. Secondly, facilitating dialogue and advocacy for resources and coordinated action will enable more effective actions. Thirdly, collaboration with a range of partners, as shown in the guidance, will make all of our work that much more effective and make complementary activities and better resource utilization that much more likely. UNESCO and our partners have begun the process of engaging ministries of education and their stakeholders to apply the guidance to their national contexts. At this very moment, our team is actively engaged in an orientation and training workshop in Dakar with the Ministry of Education, staff from 5 countries in West and Central Africa, along with NGO and other partners. And we have a similar workshop to follow in March with 13 countries of the Eastern and Southern African region. And finally, slide 15, thank you all so much for your attention and allowing me to share about this new resource. And I welcome your questions and comments at the end of the webinar. Thank you. I'd like to hand over now to our second speaker, which is Julie Hanson Swanson of USAID.
Thank you, Jenelle, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Right now, I will talk about the SRGBV measurement framework. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I will present major findings of a literature review on how SRGBV is defined and studied, and then I will present a framework to measure SRGBV. Next slide. So working with RTI International, we conducted a literature, and the objectives were to identify overarching SRGBV types to align more closely around a common set of definitions, review common methodologies used in research and evaluation of SRGBV, identify which methodologies used to study SRGBV appear promising, and finally to then inform our conceptual framework for measuring SRGBV. Next slide. So a key objective of the review was to identify how researchers conceptualized SRGBV and determine if there was sufficient commonality to allow alignment around a clear definition. The greatest conceptual commonalities were found for bullying and corporal punishment, and the greatest variance was found for sexual harassment and its relationship to sexual violence. So we concluded that despite these variances, there was sufficient literature that conceptualized sexual harassment as a form of sexual violence. So this term need not be distinguished from sexual violence in the definition. Although there are nuanced differences in how acts of SRGBV are conceptualized, the review showed that there is sufficient overlap and commonality among researchers to adopt three broad categories of SRGBV with clear and succinct definitions. And those are bullying, corporal punishment, and sexual violence. Next slide, please. So, the most predominant method used to study SRGBV is qualitative, yet studies often use mixed method design to collect a broad base of information. Overwhelmingly, the study design most applied for investigations of the sub-area of sexual violence is a mixed methods approach, which uses a combination of survey data collection, administrative data, in-depth interviews, and focus groups. Next slide. So which methodologies used to study SRGBV appear promising? The researchers found that studying SRGBV using face-to-face questionnaires administered by researchers who are of the same sex and who are not authority figures such as a teacher or school official improves student informant's feelings of safety and increases the likelihood of full disclosure. Next, please. So this was the conceptual framework that grew out of the work from the literature review. And as I just mentioned, we identified three areas that could be used as the basis of research, and that is bullying, sexual violence, and corporal punishment. And certainly many of us are familiar with using, as Jenelle pointed out in the beginning of the presentation, of using the concepts of psychological, physical, and sexual violence as a way to think of SRGBV. And that's a good framework, although those three types of violence do overlap. So because bullying can be physical and psychological, as corporal punishment can be physical beatings or public humiliation by a teacher of a student. So from a research point of view, it is better to have categories that are as mutually exclusive as possible. Next slide. So the SRGBV survey instruments consists of the following. there are a suite of survey instruments or modules that are flexible, so they can be used in applied research, during routine monitoring, and during impact evaluations of SRGBV prevention and response programs. The measurement framework was developed to provide a one-stop shop for SRGBV measurement, including survey instruments used to collect a variety of data. The types of data include the nature and extent of the various forms of SRGBV, attitudes and beliefs about gender equality, gender norms, and the power relations that produce and perpetuate SRGBV, and perceptions of school climate. The survey instruments were developed for students aged 8 to 18, teachers and other personnel and parents and other caregivers at the primary or secondary level. And of course, between 8 and 18, those age groups were broken out so they were age appropriate. So in addition to the survey instruments, there's implementation guidance to shape planning, implementation of the surveys, and data analysis. Next, please. So survey set 1 is for students. This encompasses 5 modules, which one includes the SRGBV scenarios, which are used as an icebreaker. I will get into more detail in later slides. Then a survey of experiences of SRGBV, survey of perceptions of school climate, survey of attitudes and beliefs, and then survey of student demographics and socioeconomic wealth. Next slide. Survey set 2 is for teachers and other school personnel. This comprises 4 modules. First, survey experience of SRGBV from the point of view of teachers, survey of teacher disciplinary practices, a survey of perceptions of school climate, and finally a survey of attitudes and beliefs. Next slide. The third group of people to be surveyed are parents and other caregivers. And this is limited to 2 modules, one on perceptions of school climate and a study of attitudes and beliefs. Next slide. So this table demonstrates the depth and breadth of the instrument that, as I said, the 3 types of SRGBV, bullying, corporal punishment, sexual violence, are studied, both from the perspective of victim or perpetrator. And those are the number of items for each type of violence. Next, please. So I mentioned the SRGBV scenarios. These are used for student interviews, and they are a set of stories and interview guidelines from which users can select icebreakers to be used in the module of Survey of Experience of SRGBV. The scenarios, which are each between 150 and 200 words in length, provide a more child-friendly context in which to introduce the discussion of SRGBV experience. The scenarios, which are read to the student aloud, help to distance the student from his or her own experience, which could be often disturbing, but provides a context to discuss different types of SRGBV in a more informal setting. Next, and this looks at the different types of violence that can take place. So finally, we have this measurement framework was developed under an AID contract. It was reviewed multiple times by members of the Global Working Group to End SRGBV. And then this past spring, we piloted the survey instruments in Uganda. So at this point, the next phase of the measurement framework, we would like to pilot the survey instruments in another African country, and then we would also like to design a user-friendly toolkit. Right now, the measurement framework publication is a very strong, rigorous description of the research behind. Can everybody still hear me? Okay, so this, what we would like to do is to develop a toolkit that is more user-friendly so that a wide range of partners can take advantage of it. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions. And next slide.
I'm delighted to be part of this presentation. I want to thank the previous presenters. My name is Hassan Muluusi, and I'm working with Raising Voices. I'm here with the colleague Deepa, the product of Raising Voices. I want to share with you a practical experience of using the Good Schools Toolkit in Uganda to reduce school-related gender-based violence in schools. I would like to address myself in terms of the snapshot. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so my presentation will follow a snapshot of the context of Uganda. Would like to know why it's important for us to address gender and relationships in schools. It is also important for us to get a reflection on how the Good Schools model has tried to address gender and relationships in schools. But we also like to look at the impact it has created over time in the schools where we have implemented, and also would be very interested in knowing the implications of addressing relationships and gender. Next slide. Okay, so the context in Uganda is such that we have, like in many other parts of the world, high rates of violence, and these contribute to dropout rates, high dropout rates, and poor performance of the children in school. In terms of girls' education, we see them being undermined by gender biases and other discriminatory practices. Uganda is also organized hierarchically in terms of gender and relationships. We see disparities between males and females in terms of power distribution. But also recently, we are beginning to witness shifting trends in terms of how to address SRGB in schools, to address it and deal with the schools in terms of the culture rather than identify or deal with incidents just as corporal punishment. Next slide. So we would like to address ourselves on why it is important to address relationships and gender. Why would we invest resources in doing such an activity of violence prevention? One, we believe that our investments, our work will yield good results in terms of preventing mistreatment in school from teachers and to children to children. And this is a potential aspect that can begin violence. So when we address it, we'll be able to prevent violence that is likely to happen thereafter. We would also like to make learning at school more engaging, more interesting, and accessible to all children. Then we would also like to promote help seeking, especially for girls when they suffer gender discrimination practices. We would also like to support especially the girl child to witness achievement through her education lifeline by addressing gender and social inequities that may be undermining their education. But we would also like to capitalize on this malleable developmental state, because then the children will grow up with gender sensitive attitudes and beliefs. Next slide. Okay, now we would like to understand a little bit about what is this good school approach or model we are using in Uganda. I would like to say, as you may see in the visual part of it, it's a 6-step process that we created that we created in Uganda with working with schools and teachers in schools. And this approach provides opportunities to all stakeholders in the school to shape their own learning environment. We developed this as Raising Voices in consultation with the schools in Uganda and students and teachers together. We are now running about 750 schools. We are running this program in about 760 schools. Sorry about the figure in the slide. This is recent data we've been able to gather. Next slide. So what are the aims of the good school, the broader aims of the good school? We would like to say that the broader aim is to reduce violence against children in schools, violence from children to children, violence meted against the girls, and other aspects. Then we would like also to increase the use of, just to go back a little bit on the previous slide, how do we address this violence? We try to address the operational culture of the schools. How the schools operate on a regular basis, on a daily basis. We work with teachers and children to ensure, and the parents to ensure that their culture works for them and is what they are part of. Then we would like also to use the toolkit to increase the use of positive discipline practices within the school so that practices of corporal punishment and other hardline disciplinary measures can be prevented or eliminated in schools. Then we would like also to see children taking active participation in shaping their own culture, because we believe they are such a powerful agency in trying to modify or change their own experience of school. We would like also, through the toolkit, to create new standards for behavior at school that consider fairness and equality of all, and that will lead to schools demonstrating and creating their own policies they believe in. Next slide. Okay, now I would like to see specific efforts the good school puts in. And we largely enter school on the basis of promoting good and working and helpful relationships. These are between teachers and students, relationships between students and fellow students. So we do this through the following. One most important aspect of practice is to do teacher training. So specifically concerning gender-based violence, we do train teachers by bringing out or discussing stories and dilemmas that are attached to girls' experiences of violence. And from these trainings, we are able to change teachers' attitudes and also the children themselves. That's why in that quote, you can see one of the teachers in one of the schools acknowledging that the training empowered him and made him change their belief and attitude towards the girls and the girls' potential, to the effect that they were ready to now make use of the girls in the football team. Then we would also see that we have done a lot of work in terms of supporting teachers and students to create gender equitable policies. And this comes at the level when they have attained sufficient knowledge that will be able to help them design these policies. We also see teachers teachers conducting a good school morning. And this is a campaign we design on a weekly basis, depending on the school context, for at least 10 to 20 minutes. A session that is simply dedicated to discussing gender and power relationships in school setup. Then at Raising Voices, we've also deliberately coordinated a violence against children learning center, and gender courses are given paramount attention. And we bring many people to this center to learn and interact with many of the aspects around gender and gender relationships in school. Then finally, on that slide, we also look at the community, because we are implementing a whole school approach. So we see community school interactions where the school conducts outreach to the community, but also many of the activities will bring the community into school, into dialogue and discussions about issues. Next slide. So how do we help especially the children and the girls specifically to understand issues of gender around themselves? We've designed simple, usable, and interesting communication materials, just as you can see in that slide. And these include images, they include booklets, they include cartoons, posters, and all aspects that we believe can be of interest and attractive to the children so that our ideas can be understood. Next slide. Having worked with the Good School Toolkit over time, now over 10 years of experience, we conducted a randomized control trial in one of the districts, and this is Luwero, where we put some schools under control and others intervention. And what emerged from the randomized control trial indicated to us that there was 42% reduction in the risk of physical violence at school experienced by children from their teachers. And the question was referring to the past week. And one of the children actually confirmed by saying, in that period of implementation, their teachers used to cane a lot, but during the implementation and over the period, they experience peace, where peace now means they're experiencing less of the physical violence. Then we see students in intervention schools also reporting improved feelings of well-being at school. They are reporting safety at school, that they are more connected to their school, and also they feel they belong to the school and they would like to come to school on a regular basis. Then we also witnessed a 40% reduction in the risk of violence from children, as you may have read about it. Next slide. So what are the big implications? What does it mean to address gender and relationships in school? We see enormous benefits and dividends paying off if you get engaged in this work. And here are some of them. One, we see schools trying to appreciate, they begin to appreciate and realize that benefits are for all children. When you talk about gender, it's a common belief. People want to say there are issues of girls, but here we will see teachers, parents, and everyone realizing that this benefits everyone in the school, so they would put their energy into it. Then we also see teachers and parents begin to get more involved in supporting girls' education, talking to them more regularly where they're experiencing challenges and hurdles in their education. Then we see teachers role model gender equitable behavior because they now do that on an informed ground. Then boys and girls begin to project themselves as future men and women and try to treat themselves with equal worth. Then we also see relationships between adults, and these are teachers, the administrators, the parents, the school management members, and the relationships between adults and children also beginning to improve. Last slide. Thank you, and welcome any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope that everyone has been able to follow some of the comments, the questions in the conversation pane that have been coming up. It's been quite rich. Some of the comments, well, some of the questions rather, have actually been responded to by different colleagues, including from UNESCO, working in different parts of this area. But I am going to pull out a couple and redirect these to each of the different speakers, including myself, as appropriate. Once again, encouraging you all to just mute your mics so that we reduce the feedback that we might be getting. Great, thank you. All right, let's go from the last presentation back up. We had a question for Hassan from Irene asking, where is the program implemented? Presumably in Uganda, this example, rural or urban schools, or perhaps both, and in what context is SRGBV more prevalent? And also for you, Hassan, is the VAC Learning Center in each school, and how do you address the issues of space to set up the center? Do you want to take those?
Thank you very much. I would like to say we are working both in rural and urban schools, and we would like to see how it manifests. How do rural schools experience violence differently from the urban schools? So in terms of where we are implementing, that's it, town, urban, and rural. Then I didn't get the other question quite well. I don't know whether my colleague Deepak heard it. We didn't hear it well as either.
Hi, Jenelle. I can tell you again, the VAC Learning Center, how do you manage to find space to set up these centers? Are they in schools or somewhere else?
Okay. The Learning Center is hosted by Raising Voices, and it is at the Raising Voices offices. So from the experience of working with the schools, we see increasing need, even from the communities, for people wanting to engage more with issues of school-related gender-based violence and violence in general. So we host it at Raising Voices, and people and agencies and civil society members apply. Then we organize systematic modules depending on where they are getting stuck in their work or their interest. They will come to Raising Voices, and then we'll take them through a series of learning processes, visualizing materials, but also practically interacting with staff to get more information around preventing violence. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Hassan. I want to move on to some questions concerning evaluation, which I'll direct to both you again, Hassan and Julie. First of all, Marigan is asking what have been the challenges around that may have arisen in the evaluation process of the Good Schools Toolkit, and then coming back to the USAID measurement framework. Julie, we have another question asking about the conceptual overlaps in terms of the types of violence and their expressions. Do these pose a problem in terms of measurement, and how is that addressed?
May I start? This is Julie. Well, I think that's why we're using the topics of bullying, corporal punishment, and sexual violence rather than psychological, physical, and sexual, because there is certainly less overlap. If you're comparing bullying to corporal punishment, there really isn't overlap. So we've tried to use those three domains of corporal punishment, bullying, and sexual violence as a way to structure these survey questions, because we haven't found that there has been that overlap.
Thanks, Julie. Hassan?
So maybe if I can also make a comment on Hassan's behalf. My name is Deepak, and I'm a co-director at Raising Voices. Evaluation is something that we have spent a lot of time thinking, especially in terms of how do we understand the effect of the intervention that we have actually put in place. There are a couple of things that we needed to address. One is that we needed to ask very specific questions about experiences if we were to determine, actually ascertain usable information. So for example, we split the experience of violence into physical violence, sexual violence, emotional or psychological violence. And within each of those, we asked very specific questions like, did somebody hit you? Did somebody kick you? Did somebody pinch you? Did somebody do this? Very specific question. And then we also linked it to last week, because we found in our formative research that the most reliable information in terms of severity and frequency was if it was located in a specific time frame, especially when we were talking with children. So in essence, our experience was that you have to ask questions very specifically, and you have to also be clear about the time frame that you're referring. We also found that you have to ask questions about similar things to adults and children, because often we found that we found discrepant answers from both adults and children. Adults tended to underestimate considerably the amount of violence that they were inflicting on children. And so in our data, we found consistently that children were much more reliable informants about the experience of violence that they were experiencing than adults. And then the third thing is to triangulate qualitative information with quantitative information, so that we not only relied on one channel of information, but then asked what was credible information in terms of how it was coming to us. So those were some of the challenges. We've published this in peer-reviewed journal, and if anybody is interested in findings around our evaluation, our methodology, the tools we used, they are readily available from our website, and they're also published. So just write to us, and we can send you the tools and papers. Thank you.
Brilliant, Deepak. Thank you so much. I don't doubt that you'll be getting an influx of requests for more information based on the interest. Another quick question about evaluation. Julie, for you, Mohini is asking about the measurement of outputs and whether or not I'm trying to find back that question in the pane. Yes. Does the framework allow for the measurement of assessing outputs of different interventions? And she's asking, I guess, in terms of alignment with the 6 areas, programmatic areas of the SRGBV guidance, does it measure outputs related to these core intervention areas?
Thank you. That's a great question. The survey modules that we've developed are for collecting information that could be used as a baseline and then an end line to measure changes in attitudes and incidents. So it would measure the changes from an intervention, but it would measure more outcomes than outputs. And so it is designed really to be used as a baseline and an end line to measure the results or the outcomes of interventions.
Thank you, Julie. 2 more questions on the measurement framework. Amy Jo is asking if the review came across any use of audio computer-assisted self-interview, ACASI. I'm not familiar with that. Maybe you can tell us. And also, Caroline is asking about bullying and corporal punishment that's not gender-related. Now, I know she's asking that in relation to the measurement framework and how you set up your parameters and what you counted as SRGB violence versus violence that could be perceived as having not been based on gender. And I think that's a very interesting question, and we'd love your feedback.
Yes. The literature review, that first document that we developed, it does have a piece on ACASI. I find it very interesting, a very interesting approach to use when you are trying to collect information about sensitive topics, about people's personal behavior vis-a-vis sensitive topics such as sexual violence and abuse. That approach is not part of the measurement framework, which does focus on very traditional survey instruments. But I would be very interested to see people implementing that approach in SRGBV. As far as bullying and corporal punishment, the non-gender aspects, I guess, having been being a person who's worked in gender for about 25 years, it's hard for me to not see non-gendered aspects of bullying and corporal punishment. And I guess at the end of the day, if you are in a school, I don't think it matters if to have to say, well, this bullying is non-gendered and this is gendered. I think the main point is that a gender lens is very important to use with both these types of violence, because as we know, the underpinnings of this violence is based on power relations and dynamics between men and women, boys and girls, and other genders. So I think the overarching takeaway is that we really need to look at all types of violence through a gender lens.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. I'd like to really underscore that last point, that really the goal that we're going after is not merely the elimination of school-related gender-based violence, which is valuable, but that's a process towards a higher goal of a safe and inclusive learning environment where young people benefit and fulfill their right to education. So you're quite right that what we want to have is a safe and enabling environment where violence just doesn't happen or can be reduced and its deleterious effects. Another question for both Hassan and Julie as we start to wrap up is asking about how to ensure the safety of students who are maybe reporting SRGBV or taking part perhaps even in a study as baseline or endline surveys. So from both the Good Voices experience and Julie as well, from both piloting the measurement framework, what was the process of making teachers and schools comfortable to participate and then even get a system up and running?
Well, I think safeguarding the health, well-being, and safety of children is paramount. And when one starts to research school-related gender-based violence, I think children's safety and well-being has to be uppermost. That needs to be taken very, very seriously. So part of the guide, there is a section on ethical guidelines. And whenever you're going out in the field and doing any kind of data collection, part of your team needs to be a male and female counselor, because as we know, children discussing this could trigger negative traumatic experiences. And so to prepare for that, there do need to be counselors, both male and female, on site. And then also the research teams have to be very conversant and expert as to what are the national laws in their country. If they hear of a child who's been abused, if they hear a child who's been the victim of a crime, then they need to be very clear on what they are supposed to do in terms of reporting.
So I agree with
everything. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Julia just said. In addition to that, from our own experience, what we found is that it is absolutely crucial that any organization that deems to ask children about some very personal things like their experience of violence has a very clear response and referral mechanism in place, and a written down one, so that there's a tree in place in terms of if this happens, this is what should happen. If this happens, that should happen, and so forth. And all researchers should be trained very carefully to be aware of that. The second thing that we also found that was really important is to make clear to children that who might you share this information with and under what circumstances. That truly determines the quality of information that children actually give us, if they have assurance of confidentiality, but also understanding that there are certain requirements of researchers if there's imminent danger to the child. And then the third is that if you're working in a place like Uganda, and in many developing countries are similar to this, often the existing referral mechanism look great on paper, in practice is non-existent. So you have to be prepared for some form of immediate response to a child who is disclosing what may be sometimes very traumatic experiences. So in essence, to be prepared to respond when you're asking children very sensitive questions.
And can I also that's very important that those systems are in place. So there is that confidence on the part of parents and children that any information that is shared will be held in confidence.
And by the way, the listeners might also be interested to know that we did a nested study as part of our evaluation in terms of what was happening with the referral mechanism. And we've also published that in peer-reviewed journal in case anyone is interested in terms of how we address this particular issue. Write to us and we can send that paper along to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know that I haven't to all of the questions, and I am sorry if yours was missed, but we are coming to the end of the session. So I would like to hand over back to our moderator, Mohini, so she can bring us to a close. Mohini?
Thank you, Jenelle. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Hassan and Deepak. I think it was an excellent webinar, and in that you provided us the global guidance and overview on school-related gender-based violence. We then looked at a measurement framework for looking at outcomes for our programming, and then saw a very specific example, a good case study of what's been done in Uganda by raising voices. So it's been really enriching to hear all of your different perspectives in this webinar. I would like to conclude by thanking you all and also thanking all of the participants. We've had a great turnout today for joining the webinar. And I'd also like to remind you that the next webinar will come up on the 15th of March, and it'll be on school feeding or school meals, commemorating the International School Meal Day in March. So I look forward to having many of you back for that webinar. Thank you so much for this very informative presentation and discussions. Bye-bye.